established protocol this afternoon so that we can make the best of our time. I will want to please just make a little reminder to you regarding the list of persons we are lucky enough to have with regard to this program, so that you also take note of saying on subsequent occasions. Prior to last week, we had Justice Amy Short here to speak on the excessive powers of the President. Honorable OQUAYE was to speak on the 1992 Constitution proposals for amendment last week, but he was caught in London and he's just arrived. Of course, he'll be rescheduled accordingly. So last week I actually filled in with another topic accordingly. Today we have Professor Ernest Kofi Abuchi, Development Constitutionalism. That is Development and Constitutionalism, Building a Trusteeship that works and benefits citizens. Next week, we're moving to the mountains and we're going to have a session with former President J.A. Kufuor. He will speak on powers of the President, the Council of State, and other pertinent areas. Her Lordship, His Lordship Justice S.A. Brobe, former Justice of the Supreme Court, will speak on local government and chieftaincy the week after. That's November 29th. Her Ladyship, sometimes I find that difficult to say. Honorable OQUAYE will tell you that when we were being trained as lawyers in Britain, we knew them all as lordships. But times appear to be changing. Maybe they will not really change as people come to accept our way of doing it. But Her Ladyship, Justice Kufuor, former Chief Justice, will speak on the judiciary and matters arising. That should be very interesting, and you want to book seats. 6th December. 13th December, Mami Gichi Jando, Doctor, former head of the Political Science Department, will take the topic Gender and the Constitution. We have other ladies and gentlemen lined up, including former Minister of Finance, Dr. Professor Buti, and others, and I trust that God willing, come even January, we'll continue with this discourse. The Constitution has been tried, tested in many ways, found capable of resolving situations. At the same time, there have been some difficulties. And it will be interesting, for example, to listen to Justice Brobe as to the dynamics of the situation when the constitution making process was actually going on, when he was the Secretary of the Assembly. These are worth noting even as we propose such an amendment.
While this remains truly puzzling, given the centrality of natural resources to the constitutional governance and the key reason for the menace of winner takes all in our body politic, by which political parties and actors strive to win power in order to have exclusive access and control over the resources of state. Discussions around the use of management of Ghana's natural resources have in general remained patchy, even within the policy community and the activist world. And the factors for these are not too readily apparent. For all it is worth, however, I need to confess that today's topic has forced me to reflect. Can you please hear me? I don't know. Maybe I should just proceed. It's a bit. Should I proceed? Okay, all right. So, for all it's worth, however, I need to confess that today's topic has forced me to reflect anew on the complexities of power, patronage, resource, and citizenship vulnerabilities in ways that I have not often done in the past. Nagging questions like the true and not fictional sense of representation, the true meaning of ownership, stake and the limits on government's right of disposition and exploitation, as well as agency capture and the dangers of legitimate but reckless asset or resource exploitation and disposition, have troubled the implementation of the values of the constitutional trusteeship under the Constitution. And it is on the basis of these worrying and anecdotal experiences surrounding the implementation of the trusteeship mandate of the executive and its agencies that I speak on today. The inception of the 1992 Constitution ushered in renewed hopes of citizenship ownership and participation in the governance process of Ghana, following years of military dictatorships in the 1980s. The general mood which greeted the adoption of the Constitution principally marked the overall percentage of the voting populace approving the document, and that reflected the expectations of Ghanaians about the nascent governance process evolving. 30 years after the initial adoption of the Constitution, however, it is generally agreed among commentators that the regime has broadly failed to deliver on the promises, hopes, and expectations shaping in its enactments. While the reasons are broad and varied, the Constitution has in the main been said to suffer from enforcement deficits, arising mainly from a lack of desire by actors to constrain themselves within the limits set by law and the constitutional text and spirit, and more crucially, to help promote the benefits of constitutional rule for all. Others have identified the toxic dominance of politics and partisan politics and the deep fragmentations as significant causative factors accounting for this suboptimal effect of the Constitution. While easily recognizable, the problem of winner-takes-all policy has proved intractable and seemingly impossible to deal with. That policy which has been the practice where elections and their outcomes determine the total access to the bounty of power and state resources itself, has ensured that elections have always been keenly and often destructively contested, and the fight for political power usually characterized by deadly fervor. Under the winner-takes-all phenomenon, the winning parties immediately see themselves as the rightful beneficiaries of not only power, but the trappings of authority and access to state resources to the exclusion of persons deemed members or sympathizers of opposing parties. It has therefore been a common complaint of service providers awarded contracts under a departing regime to allege that the termination of their contracts have been so terminated on grounds of political discrimination or victimization. The persistence of political party favoritism arising out of ideological and other resource preferences has challenged the equal protection provisions of the Constitution, notably under Article 17. More functionally, the deliberate exclusion of significant numbers of our population from the distribution of resources and entitlements on grounds of politics threaten the stability of the Fourth Republic and remains a key fault line of our maturing democratic experiment. From a more consequentialist standpoint, the menace of the winner-takes-all robs us of the best of talents in national governance and rewards mediocrity as a factor of merit, becomes sidelined in resource distribution and appointments to political office, and state power, state house, become the preserve of the few, who are rightly politically aligned. But even more problematic, and some will argue dangerous, the phenomenon reinforces our natural divisions, such as ethnicity, while distorting the role and place of ideology. For the Constitution's conception of ideology is one geared towards development and not a tool of hate or enmity. The weaponization of political ideology and party membership has derailed the benefits of association politics, which was fundamentally designed to breed a diversity of perspectives and promote the marketplace of ideas. And this conversation, very funny enough, came up in a conversation that was held in the group that I will probably just call, for this purpose, the group of eminent friends. Allied to problems like corruption, waste, executive overreach, and general failures of systemic checks and balances, the winner-takes-all phenomenon exacerbates a complicated resource management situation under the constitutional arrangement of the Fourth Republic. Ghana's experience with fragmented political relations under the Fourth Republic has been debilitating. 2 elections have been fought to the brink, and the looming prospect of civil disturbances have always tasked the very foundations of our polity. The uncompromising desire to control the resources of state has led to a situation in which the quest for power and control over state resources has become an end in itself, and the exclusion of political opponents, actual or perceived, is a strategic means of sustaining power. Given that political and constitutional experts broadly agree that the Fourth Republic has been marked by corruption, dissipation of state assets, and depletion of endowed resources, there is the need to rethink existing constitutional models. In the medium term, the architecture of any reform for the future of the Constitution must reflect the frustrations of people must reflect the frustrations of people towards experiencing the tangible constitution under which Ghanaians feel the benefits of citizenship. One in which public goods are equitably distributed, and in which resources of states are sustainably managed. In this short paper, I reflect on a failed principle of trusteeship of the 1992 Constitution. I will suggest workable reforms that can be adopted by ways of amendment to the Constitution. Why the topic trusteeship? This short recommendatory paper reflects on the key issue of constitutional regime on natural resource management and the governance framework established thereof. Within the scope of the 1992 Constitution, the regime established evolves around the concept of constitutional trusteeship, which both defines and limits the scope of the conferred authority on constitutional actors by the President. Ghana is a natural resource dependent country, and given the relatively high rent associated with the award of contracts, particularly in the extractive sector, the tendency and prospect of state functionaries to be influenced in compromising on the interest of the state in the award of contracts in this area is high. This creates complex incentives and therefore calls for a higher level of constitutional oversight designed to rein in opportunistic behavior. While the provisions in the 1992 Constitution prima facie compare favorably with regimes contained in the constitutional framework of other countries, the implementation of the rules and outcomes of the work of regulatory and accountability institutions demonstrate a clear failure to achieve the framer intent behind the regime. While it is arguable that corruption plays a leading role in frustrating the ends of the existing regime, poor negotiating competencies also affect Ghana's capacity to leverage the benefits of its natural resources. Many reasons account for the failure to take advantage of the negotiating process, not the least of which is the issue of information asymmetry between actors in government on the one hand and officials of multinational companies involved in the extractive sector on the other. And this will be my concluding statement with a quotation I will make from the very lead drafter of the Constitution, Nana S.K.B. Asante. The failure to exercise the utmost negotiating competency raises critical issues in accountability and trusteeship, and the extent to which the objectives that the regime established under the 1992 Constitution are met. This brief argues that while the foundational value and basis for the use of the concept of constitutional trusteeship is accurate and well thought through, the regime has failed to achieve the dual goals of rational management and utilization inherent in the concept. Broadly basing itself on anecdotal factors or reasons, I argue that there is the need to reform the existing regime for optimal performance. Original values of the Constitution. Underpinning the 1992 Constitution are some fundamental values of constitutional governance, and notable among these are the values of limitation to political power, actor accountability, citizenship and the Commonwealth, and sustainable use and preservation of resources. The value of limitation of power, generally exemplified the concept of constitutionalism, is the linchpin of the structure of the Constitution. By constraining the exercise of governmental powers, Constitutionalism ensures that the basis for the conferment of power is maintained, and that state officials operate in the name and on behalf of citizens. The ubiquity of constitutional limitations in the document indicates that the framers of the Constitution intended to establish a framework that constrains the actions of officials in a manner that ensures that power is exercised for the benefit and for the purpose of its deployment. Indeed, the preamble states, and that's the very first provision of the Constitution, that the exercise of the sovereignty of Ghana shall be done on behalf of Ghanaians. To conceive and concretize the substantive limitations imposed, the framework inserted accountability strictures, such as Parliament's oversight and powers on the executive and other agencies of state, the exercise of judicial power over executive and administrative action, as well as the powers of other mediating bodies, including SHRAJ. Together, the regime on constitutional limitation appears sufficient, prima facie, and should ordinarily be adequate to guarantee the productive exercise of power. Yet experience has shown rather clearly that the regime in place through the text has largely failed to constrain the exercise of power in a manner that helps attain the overall purpose of conferring these powers for purposes of constitutional trusteeship. In framing the ethos of constitutional accountability under the Constitution, the drafters obviously intended to ensure that ultimate power is reposed in the people, for whom and on whose behalf the exercise of governmental powers are so undertaken. See the preamble. Constitutional accountability as exemplified under the Constitution compels feedback on the part of constitutional actors when they purport to exercise powers vested in their offices. For example, the State of the Nation's address, annually given by the President, is predicated on the expectation that he will give a comprehensive account of the management of the various facets of governance activity affecting the country. The feedback is a functional medium for Parliament, as intended to scrutinize government policy and performance across the spectrum of conferred authority. While fundamentally good in its conception, and some will argue deployment, the value of accountability under the 92 Constitution suffers from conception-implementation dissonance or flaws. The regime as laid out under the Constitution seemed broad and reasonably adequate, yet in practice, Parliament has been heavily criticized over the years for failing to effectively check the executive, thereby artificially reinforcing the overall powers of the executive. Indeed, the Nana Eskebi Asante, who was the chairman of the Committee of Experts, has asserted in recent times that he also believes that the powers of the executive are excessive. Dare I say that with the greatest respect to the very eminent Nana, whose opinion I hardly ever disagree with, on this occasion, I'm one of the very few who actually thinks that should Parliament have been doing its work, the President's powers are actually not that excessive. The reason they are excessive is because Parliament has allowed the President to be both the President and a legislative entity at the same time. The failures in exerting the requisite checks against the executive has become emblematic of the general failures of constitutionalism under the Constitution in Ghana in general. A key consequence of the failures of Parliament to assert its broad institutional superintendence over other organs and key agencies of government has been the gradual erosion of citizens' influence over the management of state resources and their interests represented in these resources. Investing these resources in elected actors and recognized agencies of state, led by the President, the Constitution sought to establish a trusteeship system in which the prudent management and use of these resources will be overseen by trustee officers, the executive in Commonwealth, superintended by Parliament. That is the structure. The widespread prevalence of corruption, if general sentiment are to be believed, reflects a lessening of that value and a rise of a new counter-ethic, namely the exploitation of public resources for private gain and the capture of elective officials by powerful vested groups and parochial ambition. That was a conversation we were having before we started this lecture, and at a point I was wondering whether I was going to be able to say something new, because we've actually already had a lecture in the back room. Constitutional trusteeship. What are the key tenets? Constitutional trusteeship is based on the idea that the power of constitutional governance springs from the people, over whom the power is exercised. It fundamentally, therefore, rests on the principle of responsible leadership. and tasks the wielder of power to act in the capacity of a trustee, with the ultimate interest of the people driving the decision-making process of a power wielder's office. Consequently, constitutional trusteeship is made up of certain important building blocks which both empower and constrain actors on the powers bestowed. The concept therefore operates on the same wavelengths as the doctrine of constitutionalism, but with a broader parameter within the context of the empowering effect it confers on decision makers. Its creation and deployment under the 92 Constitution therefore evinces the following. A clear statement of benefits and responsibility. B, accountability mechanisms and institutions created. And C, vesting of all residual authorities or resources in an identified or identifiable actor. A, benefits and responsibility. The Constitution has identified circumstances where assets and resources of states are vested in identified authority. The notable actor in this regard is the President of Ghana. Article 257 is especially worthy of note in this regard, where the Constitution explicitly provides that, quote, all public lands in Ghana shall be vested in the President on behalf of and in trust for the people of Ghana. Being specifically dedicated to the protection and management and preservation of public lands in Ghana, this provision is one of the salient provisions of the Constitution, given the complexities of land management in Ghana. The scope of the provision is clear and encapsulates all lands belonging to the realm of the Ghanaian Republic. Even clearer are the beneficiaries of the provision. Article 257 states that the lands deemed or classified as public lands are to be held on behalf of and for the benefit of the Ghanaian people. The implications of this benefit would, on reflection, seem rather straightforward, given that it is expected to be deployed and utilized for the ultimate welfare of Ghanaians. The essence of the benefits conferred is to create a right of claim in all Ghanaians in respect to the management and deployment of the lands, and to thereby limit the powers of constitutional actors in how they apply the resources of state in their governance dynamics. On the other hand, the necessity of establishing a trust for public asset management instead of a general authority in Ghanaians is not hard to find. Representative democracies, again, this is a subject that came up very shortly. Representative democracies are essentially systems in which delegated authority is exercised or supposed to be exercised on behalf of a group or population whose sheer size and demobilized character tends to make it impossible for them to operate on their own. Coupled with the issue of information deficits, disparities and asymmetries of information, elected officers vested with dedicated constitutional authority tend to be better placed to take rational, effective, and coordinated decisions on behalf of their populace. The provision contained under Article 257, Article 527, squarely reflects the residuality of the authority of states vested in the President and intended to enable him manage and utilize the assets in a manner that advances the development needs of Ghana. Crucially, Chapter 21 creates the trusteeship responsibility, which implies that the President is impressed with the powers and limitations of a trustee. Given the Constitution does not define the boundaries and contours of constitutional trusteeship, it is arguable that the trusteeship responsibilities of the President includes the standard common law responsibilities of a trustee, in addition to the specific constitutional strictures incumbent on him, which in this case would imply that under the common law, the President is obligated to manage the assets of states responsibly. Under the Constitution, we go beyond this by including provisions of Chapter 5, the provisions of the Directive Principles of State Policy, Chapter 6 actually, which mandates that the President manages the resources of states in a manner which is best conducive to the development needs of the country. Accountability mechanisms and institutions. A key aspect of the trusteeship regime under the 92 Constitution is the establishment of accountability mechanisms. These mechanisms are principally designed to curb the powers of actors vested with authority to manage the assets or resources involved and to ultimately ensure responsibility in the deployment of the assets or resources. The nature of these mechanisms often varies widely under the 1992 Constitution. They have taken the form of hard norms or laws and a panoply of structures and institutional bodies empowered to demand and manage the accountability of these actors. Accountability, when exerted within the context of constitutional trusteeship, enlivens the responsibility of the trustee and ensures that the exercise of his powers with beneficiaries in mind is ultimately upheld. Constitutional accountability has the propensity to ensure active responsibility and feedback, and in the process, enable citizenship participation in resource management and use. Through representative bodies like Parliament, citizens are able to channel their grievances and concerns to government, and this enriches the process of decision-making, thereby affecting transactions involving assets. The last one here being the vesting of residual authority in an actor. Constitutional trusteeship invariably tends to vest authority in one active actor. Sitting at the apex of executive authority, the 1992 Constitution makes the President the ultimate trustee of state resources and assets, not otherwise vested in a body for any specific purpose. The ostensible purpose for this is to place responsibility for the efficient and rational management of state resources, his business, and his responsibility. As would be reiterated at the end of this paper, that model is a standard one and may not be in need of reforming per se, certainly not under this paper, even if its implementation has been troubled. What needs to be done about that is for us to increase the checks. Existing frameworks and problems. The existing frameworks on resource management and constitutional trusteeship is largely found under Chapter 21 of the 1992 Constitution, and to a limited degree, Chapter 5. The provisions of Chapter 21 establish a regime which vests the said resources in the President and imposes an obligation on him to exercise the responsibilities of a constitutional trustee in respect of all public lands, minerals, and other resources of state. The system created under the chapter of the Constitution thereby empowers the President to manage, use, and dispose of these resources in the best interest of the country and its citizenry by exercising the powers of a trustee in respect of the resources and public lands of Ghana. Under Clause 5 of Article 257, the powers of the President are made even more extensive, with the President empowered to vest other lands in the office of the President when he deems these fit. In other words, the President, under the principle of eminent domain, can acquire any private asset, can acquire any private land and vest it in the Republic through the office of the President. Rather, universal language of Clause 5, which provides that every mineral in its natural state, in, under, or upon any land in Ghana, rivers, stream, water courses throughout Ghana, the exclusive economic zone of the oceans, I inserted oceans, but the exclusive economic zone, and any area covered by the territorial sea or continental shelf is the property of the Republic of Ghana and shall be vested in the President on behalf of and in trust for the people of Ghana. The broad scope of the presidential powers on national asset and resource management and mobilization appears sufficiently designed to promote an efficient and effective regime on constitutional trusteeship. More crucially, the regime established under Chapter 21 seeks to counterbalance the powers of the President with the installation of correlative checks through institutional constitutionalism. Thus, it is provided under Article 268 that in all transactions involving the grant of a right of exploitation of mineral rights, there shall be the requirement for parliamentary approval, or in this case, actually, parliamentary ratification. In the language of the text, quote, any transaction, contract, or undertaking involving the grant of a right or concession by or on behalf of any person, including the government of Ghana, to any other person or body of persons howsoever described, for the exploitation of any mineral, water, or other natural resource of Ghana, made or entered into after the coming into force of this Constitution, shall be subject to ratification by Parliament. This provision explicitly brings Parliament into the fray of the disposition of rights through concession in respect to the mineral and other bodies' resources of Ghana. The essence of the role of parliamentary intervention in any such concession will be to subject executive decisions to the exercise of the trustee responsibilities of the President to the greater checks on accountability of Parliament. In so doing, however, the standard threshold is the ultimate best interest of the people of Ghana. It is noteworthy, however, that the limitations imposed by the constitutional requirement is ratification and not the prior approval of Parliament. The implications are significant and not perfunctory. Whereas the requirement of prior approval would have meant that the President, as a trustee, can only enter into an agreement to grant a right of exploitation or concession to a third party with the previous approval of Parliament. Parliamentary ratification implies a right of a constitutional actor, in this case the President, to grant or award any such contract to a third party and merely secure the ex post facto endorsement of Parliament. Thus, while the failure to secure the said ratification would imply the failure of any concession granted by the President in the meantime, the power of the President to grant a right of this nature is preserved without Parliament's approval from the beginning. The nature of ratification as opposed to approval as a normative constitutional requirement and the experiences under the Fourth Republic in general in this context is consequential, given how Parliament has exercised its oversight powers when sought. Acts needing parliamentary ratification have tended to be treated as perfunctory, with the institution merely rubber stamping decisions taken already. In a sense, this is understandable, given the assumption that the transactions presented would often have reached advanced stages at the time Parliament is called on to evaluate and ratify these. On the other hand, the implication of not ratifying a transaction advanced in implementation can be far-reaching, given the enormity of resources and other efforts that may have been expended in the deployment of these in the meantime. This regime dynamic appears to be a significant weak link in the accountability chain established under Chapter 21. It appears to often present Parliament with a transactional fait accompli, a situation which sits both out of tune with the overall intendment of the provisions of the Constitution in promoting the balance in the management and deployment of assets and resources of state, but also subtly overemphasizes the powers of the President at the expense of the accountability bodies, which are established to rein in the President's role as a trustee, and in the process, leverage the benefits of the people of Ghana on whose behalf the trust is created. The manifest weakness in the parliamentary oversight powers and functions is reinforced by the powers granted the institution to exempt certain categories of transactions from the purview of oversight checks. Thus, the text of the Constitution under Article 269 to the effect that Parliament may, by a resolution supported by the vote of no less than 2/3 of all members of Parliament, exempt from the provisions of Clause 1 of this article any particular class of transactions, contracts, or undertaking, essentially exposes the overall accountability provisions of the Constitution on the management of natural resources to greater dysfunction and abuse. This is essentially the case, given the reality of negative influences exerted on the legislature by the executive since the coming into force of the Constitution, the requirement of a 2/3 approval in this case notwithstanding. With the prospect of the executive courting Parliament to exempt certain classes or categories of agreement or transaction from needing parliamentary approval, the inexorable outcome is the exclusion from the checks the very categories of agreements and transactions that were intended to be the subject of oversight. The realpolitik experience of the Fourth Republic counsel against this provision, given the tendency of Parliament to be courted and manipulated by the executive and its officers in Parliament in critical transactions involving major transactions in which the latter had high stakes in their ultimate approval. While ordinarily giving an institution like Parliament the needed flexibility to make appropriate exemptions in the exercise of powers provided is justified by the circumstances of each case, both the context and the experience of Ghana since the inception of the regime in 1992 reflects a deferral of parliament in ways that promote executive abuse of authority. This is particularly so, given the characteristic winner-takes-all phenomena prevalent in Ghanaian politics, under which ruling parties tend to see the institution of parliament as an extension of the exercise of executive authority, and in respect of which the parties in parliament are expected to advance, not check, the cause of the executive inside parliament. Invest in parliament, therefore, with the power to deviate from its own oversight responsibility, promotes an outcome which can be completely counterproductive, given the warped incentives prevalent in the political system for the past 30 years. In the case of public lands, the institutional oversight established through Parliament is designed to be complemented by the operations of a Lands Commission, which is structured to provide an administrative machinery for the management of public lands. The mandate of the Commission, as stated under Article 258, is inter alia to manage public lands vested in the President and on behalf of the state. The rapacious spate of disposition of government lands for private benefits and the abject lack of coordination characterizing the development of government land and general planning implies that the Lands Commission, in its work, have lagged behind development in general, in this particular context. And in this case, I'll once again say the Council of Eminent Friends have spoken widely on this in the meeting we held just before we started this program. So I wouldn't go further into it. The problem and the challenges faced by the Commission reflects the general weaknesses of the regulatory approach adopted under this, and I'll make a comment or two about the regulatory failures. So next, I'll address you on the question of what I call the regulatory capture. Natural resource management and regulation under the Constitution and other derivative statutes are treated through the use of the subject matter agencies established under the Constitution to provide a governance framework over the specific resources in question. Thus, resources such as extractives, forest resources, water and fisheries, etc., are governed by bodies such as the Forestry Commission, the Lands Commission, the Minerals Commission, the Petroleum Commission, and other such bodies. This approach is obviously informed by the need to provide technical agencies as apex institutions designed and authorized to superintend the exploitation of natural resources on behalf of the state and within the context of the trusteeship arrangement for the benefit of citizens. Yet the reality remains that these entities have broadly failed to provide the needed template for the sustainable and beneficial exploitation of resources in the best interest of the state. Thus, the rapid issuances of licenses for the exploitation of the forest resources have resulted in the quick and significant reduction in forest size and cover, and the substantial depletion of forest resources of Ghana in general. The widespread and destructive effect of mining near water bodies and in forest reserves in instances when licenses have been issued for these activities reflect agency failure to provide the needed oversight and regulation of the various resources regulated, and in this dynamic seem to play across the field of the various institutions established to oversee the governance of Ghana's natural resources. A key reason assigned for the failure of the institutional bodies established is the problem of agency capture, under which individuals and groups tend to exert undue influence against the agencies and manipulate them for their own parochial benefits. Agency capture tends to be both destructive and difficult to deal with, given the fact that the processes and decisions made by the agencies conferring rights on third parties are facially legitimate and legal, having complied with due process. Thus, while the substantive value and judgment of these agencies could be questioned, the fact that the power exercised conferring rights spring from constitutional and statutory authority implies that it becomes difficult to challenge in practice, at least through the judicial system. On the other hand, this reality implies that a standard remedial option open to anyone seeking to challenge the exercise of the rights conferring powers of these bodies can only do so as a back-end option. In other words, by its character, the challenges to the powers of these entities cannot be preemptive, but can only be judicially impugned after events or damage has occurred through their wrongful exercise of power. This not only enhance the cost of fighting the menace within the context of regulatory capture, but also reinforces the destructive effect of the acts of capture and the intergenerational loss of natural resources. And again, as I cite my eminent friend's conversation, my attention was drawn to a Ramsar site that is now the subject of a building project. By the time you go through the court process, by the time you're able to serve evading witnesses or evading parties, the overnight buildings are complete. Regrettably, the issue of agency capture has equally impacted the oversight of Parliament. In fact, the problem may even be worse in the case of the legislative body, given the very nature of the organ, its representative mandate, and ostensible legitimacy of parliamentary lobbies. Consequently, the exertion of executive influences and the role of interested bodies in the legislative and approval processes, coupled with the role of information asymmetry, have combined to imply that Parliament is truly subject to the ebb and flow of external entities and vicissitudes. Given the sheer volume of extractive benefits and interest at stake, it is arguable that the temptation for rent and other inappropriate influences remain high, and that will likely continue to undermine the capacity of the institution to uphold accountable other agencies over which it regulates. In short, the current framework of the role and relationship of agencies, into bracket the commissions, is fraught and remains counterproductive to the interest of intergenerational equity and on the one hand, and constitutional trusteeship on the other. The original intention of vesting minerals in an executive president, overseen by an accountable parliament and executive agencies in the character of regulatory bodies, has produced a regime or outcome framed around winners and losers, in which the winners of political power have come to see natural resources as an extension of the overall quantum of power won by them at elections, and in respect of which allocations of licenses for exploitation has become a booty to be shared and distributed as political compensation. These negative incentives have acted as powerful counterweights to the lofty reasons informing the current regime and have regrettably perpetuated capture. The question still remains, however, whether, given the manifold legislative interventions, especially in the wake of the discovery of oil in commercial quantities some years back, there is still the need to introduce reforms in the Constitution. Any answer to this will have to, of necessity, reflect the extent of complementarity of these legislations and how they address the framework deficits in the Constitution. These laws have been designed to fundamentally regulate the benefits derived from the discovery of oil and gas in commercial quantities in Ghana. It is noteworthy that they introduce some key innovative oversight and accountability strictures in resource governance. For example, the Petroleum Revenue Management Act of 2011, Act 815, requires that under Section 8 of the law, the publication in both the Gazette and 2 national dailies, the records of petroleum receipts quarterly be made. Of course, the minor question that can be raised there is, who is reading the dailies today? The young men and women are busy on Twitter. If you publish them in the dailies, you still may get away with some things. The strength of this law, however, stands in isolation from the fact that although there are prohibited uses of petroleum funds, including it being given as credit to government, there are other permissible uses which could gravely be abused, including using petroleum products as cash for government payment to third parties. The requirements of submitting an environmental and sustainability plan under the Petroleum into bracket Exploration and Petroleum and Production Act 2016, Act 919, is equally instructive in the extent to which it goes to demonstrate sensitivity to sustainable use of resources. Provisions such as those contained under Sections 81 and 82 of the Act on the environmental principles and prior project impact assessment reflect awareness and avoids the dangers of environmental externality within the context of the needs of future generations and trusteeship. Yet, even this law contains no monitoring facilitation. In other words, given the technical dimensions of policing compliance in the petroleum industry on the one hand, and the paucity or dearth of capacity in Ghana the prospect of evasion and abuse exists, and Act 919 could have benefited from a requirement compelling prospectors and extractors to fund the monitoring and tracking of compliance if Ghana is to ensure the sustained and effective compliance regime. These are just two examples of the inadequacies of the regulatory regimes designed to complement the Constitution and its regime on natural resources. We can discuss further in questions. Recommendations. Complaints on the failure of citizens to benefit from the exploitation of Ghana's natural resources indicates the fact that the trusteeship regime put in place has failed to attain its goals of preserving natural resources and ensuring beneficially driven use and deployment. This is compounded by the recent spate of rapid environmental degradation arising from the removal of forest cover and the pollution of water bodies for the purposes of illegal, or rather artisanal gold mining, popularly called galamsey. That there is a need for concrete constitutional reforms is now rather obvious. The role of Parliament. Parliament's role as a gatekeeper and watchdog over the use of Ghana's natural resources needs to be further streamlined and strengthened. The current situation under which the institution's role is limited to a back-end pro forma intervention is both problematic and ineffective. The requirement for parliamentary ratification under Article 268 is problematic and weak to the extent that it makes Parliament a nominal player which can only ratify the agreement on deals which may either be fully consummated or substantially completed. As earlier argued, this reduces the audit powers of Parliament and consigns the institution to merely having to follow executive leads. This completely defeats the core values of the trusteeship system, or the trusteeship system put in place, and almost makes the approval powers of Parliament both routine and automatic. There is therefore the need to change the relationship dynamic by making all constituting Parliament into an approving entity, rather than just being a ratificatory chamber. Making Parliament an approving entity would therefore bring forward the timing of the institution's participation in deals involving the executive as a repository of the national resources wealth on the one hand, and Parliament as the vanguard representative designed to ensure accountability and the enforcement of the constitutional trusteeship. The need for reforms in this regard stands in spite of the provisions of Article 181, which requires that loan deals entered into by the government of Ghana shall be entered into with a prior parliamentary approval. The specialty character of Article 181, however, confines it to the commercial transaction or to commercial transactions involving loans, and therefore only makes it partially applicable to natural resources in general. This implies that for an effective regime on parliamentary intervention in the management and deployment of natural resources, there is the need to strengthen the particular regime by specifically mandating and empowering Parliament to exercise its approval powers beyond the current perfunctory role accorded the institution. Furthermore, and in respect of same, given the historical failure of Parliament to exert its controlling influence over the executive in matters of governance, there is the need to ratchet up the threshold of approval for transactions involving the trusteeship mandate of the executive in matters involving the natural resources of state. This is especially so given the complicated subject of corruption and rent in this area, which increases the incentive for conflict of interest and the collusive behavior in voting parties or parliamentarians. The requirement of simple majority approval, such as is contained under Article 181 and 268, is apt to lead to fragmentary behavior on the part of Parliament, as has been seen over the last 30 years with political parties acting en bloc and the majority supporting the executive action based on political and partisan beneficial considerations. The record accordingly shows that the requirement of simple majorities have been easily scalable and have resulted in the approval of obnoxious policies and questionable deals in the past. Enhancing this requirement to a higher threshold of 2/3 majority requirement approval would likely lead to higher scrutiny of projects, as the need for vote across political lines would necessarily compel greater audits of deals presented. This is not likely to solve the problem of corruption and actor capture, but would certainly make it more difficult to exploit by captors given the higher threshold involved. This requirement addresses the historical overestimation of the corporate competency of Parliament. As an institution, the Constitution accords enormous powers to Parliament and facially assumes that the organ will work to rein in executive and other actor excesses. The reality has been the opposite, and the problem of capture has operated to ensure that Parliament has largely operated to feed sectional and vested interest in particular, and the need to augment the numbers of members of Parliament in order for deals to pass is designed to minimize, if not reduce, the prospect of abuse and capture. In a similar vein, there is the need to revisit the issue of parliamentary exemption of deals requiring approval or ratification. As argued, this is susceptible to abuse, as MPs are not only immune from the problem of capture, but are enticed by it. A new regime which imposes strict rationalization and difficult processes leading to the granting of the exemptions can check the prospect of its abuse and keep it in check. I guess what I'm recommending is that should we want to keep the exemption regime, which some will argue is good for flexibility, we need to regulate it. In the circumstances, there's widespread discretion allowed Parliament. Again, this is a subject that was discussed by my group of eminent friends, of which I was very lucky to be a member this afternoon. And I've delivered a lecture listening to them. Next, experience elsewhere demonstrates the need to use constitutional reform to promote extra-legal constitutionalism. Being the natural platform for those seeking political power, political parties play pivotal roles in resource management and remain the lead abusers of the trusteeship mandate entrusted into the hands of the executive. When elections are won, presidents suffer from political party pressures. Who is appointed a minister, among others? These are decisions that are taken at the core of political party decision-making processes. The question, then, therefore, is, can we continue playing ostrich by focusing on the executive and ignoring the real source of the problem? This is especially true in the case of the vexed question of political compensation following elections and how natural resources of state have provided ready opportunities for sectional exploitation and abuse. A strategic reform which compels political parties to submit policy blueprints on their management of natural resources of state, should they win power, would provide a useful template for Parliament's exercise of its approval powers when deals are presented for approval. In other words, these blueprints will help build consensus among parties on the management of natural resources, but also provide a useful context for Parliament's exercise of its approval authorities when the parties are in office and seek approval of key agreements. They would have to show us where the agreements they seek to push through Parliament, where it fits in their pre-electoral policy blueprints as far as the extraction of natural resources are concerned. Leveraging the cooperation of political parties through mandatory constitutional requirements can be a powerful source of ensuring prudent and rational management of the natural resources of state. Yet it is evident that any such reform will have to be predicated on resourcing parties to be able to fashion out the necessary policy blueprint of the quality and depth expected. This statement is made advisedly, given the fact that our parties are generally not resourced. And being able to put together policy instruments and policy structures require a depth of intellectual activity, a depth of expertise, and often these cost money. A fourth recommendation to be made is the mandatory constitutional institutionalization of citizen participation and consultation in the approval process of natural resource agreements. Similar to public hearings by the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency, in environmental impact assessments on proposed projects, trusteeship impact assessment could afford citizens the opportunity to vent, seek explanations, and make critical inputs into projects involving natural resource exploitation. This platform of citizen venting, when mandatorily constitutionalized through reform, can reinforce the structures of transparency, of proposed transactions, and ensure that the generality of project impact is assessed and the contracting process truly democratized. A proposed constitutional reform can include a requirement that upon a formal laying of any such transaction before Parliament, the institution shall only proceed to consider it after it has conducted a trusteeship impact assessment in which the general public and groups particularly affected are heard on the relative impact of any proposed project on the trusteeship mandate of the President, and in this case, particularly on future generations. A final recommendation relates to the need to further secure the funds and earnings made on natural resources. As has been shown above, statutory provisions on the management of petroleum resources especially has shown that many laxities exist and continue to be exploited by the executive and other agencies. The establishment of investment and sovereign wealth funds have been fundamentally based on the twin assumptions that natural resources are finite and subject to exhaustion on the one hand, and the need to preserve the equity stake of future generations on the other. Ghana's experience shows that since its establishment, governments have been encircling the fund and threatening to amend the law with a view to accessing the monies therein. While core principles of constitutional trusteeship permit the trustee executive, in this case, to apply the resources of the trust for the benefit and the interest of the Ghanaian people, best practices elsewhere counsel against any use of the Heritage Fund not premised on a long-term strategy or development blueprint. At the moment, we all know we really do not have a long-term development blueprint mutually agreed on by the two political parties. And therefore, our development blueprint changes per electoral cycle. On the other hand, the relative ease with which statutes can be amended have implied that this threat remains existential and could undermine the intent behind the fund created. There is accordingly the need to reinforce the management and deployment of resources and the payment deriving from the Wealth Fund by constitutionalizing the fund and detailing the scope of its management and use, and thereby taking it out of the statutory domain. Conclusion. My concluding words, in some ways, a lamentation on the failures of the trusteeship arrangement, but also the general resource mismanagement, is echoed in the words of Nana Dr. Asante I referred to earlier, who, as we all know, was the chairman of the committee of experts who drafted the Constitution as far back as 1979. He made this statement as far back as 1979, years before he became the chairman of the committee of experts. He said, quote, "One of the greatest paradoxes in recent history is the extent to which the idea of investor ownership of natural resources, which was one of the vital foundations of the old international economic order, and indeed one of the old colonial system, persisted even after the attainment of political independence. Leaders of the third world are content to enjoy the symbols of sovereignty while the control of their vital resources remain vested in transnational corporations." Unquote. Samuel K.B. Asante, Restructuring Transnational Mineral Agreement, 1979, American Journal of International Law. The constitutional framework on the management and maximal use of natural resources under the 1992 Constitution appears to have wobbled in the face of powerful incentives and counterforces. The insertion of a constitutional obligation under Article 36(9) for the state to take steps to protect the natural environment for the sake of posterity reinforces a general obligation of constitutional trusteeship incumbent on the state, represented by the government. But as seen throughout this piece, this dynamic is weak in the absence of either an ethos of voluntary compliance or strong and robust protective regime. The suggested reforms, therefore, maintain the concrete frame of the existing regime because they are fundamentally good. In other words, I am not here to suggest a complete removal of the existing frame. The existing frame is good. They are not problematic in the main. And in our haste to change what is not working, let us not be distracted to weaken what is ideal and working as well. The president is the best actor to be invested with trustee assets, or rather, that the president is the best actor to be invested with trustee assets can hardly be challenged in any system founded on constitutional efficiency and effectiveness. In our current system, the president perhaps is the best person or the best entity to have resources vested in him. That framework and that structure is not fundamentally wrong or bad. For collegiate bodies like Parliament, do not do as well in being primary managers of resources. But the powers of the president and the manner of its exercise can be moderated in this vein, and that is what I have proposed above. Again, Parliament ought to maintain its oversight powers, and that goes without saying. But the fact that the current system remains unsatisfactory is also equally true. The suggestion, therefore, has been for Parliament to strengthen its own oversight function. And since parliamentarians have failed time and again to heed to humble counsel, to close ranks, to identify themselves as a corporate entity, and for Parliament to avoid its fragmented tendency whenever dealing with the executive. That call has been has been made decades. It's been made for a long time now, and clearly Parliament is not going to listen. And in this case, I say this respectfully, the chairman, a very respected former, as I spoke, then it just dawned on me that, unfortunately, I can't say everything I've said already. I can't unsay it. But clearly, Parliament is not interested. Parliament is not interested in the advice of closing ranks. Time and again, Parliament has demonstrated itself a fragmented entity when it matters. That council is not going to work. Therefore, the suggestion is that the processes of approval should be made difficult for Parliament. The starting point is to remove the ratificatory process, which is a back-end function which makes Parliament really not effective, and it really makes Parliament just a nominal player. So that one should be changed. But once it is made approval, simple majority approval processes, which is also what dominates in the Constitution, should change. And we should start getting to the two-thirds level. The two-thirds level will create a difficulty. And the difficulty is very often two-thirds will require crossing carpets. And crossing carpet then will mean building consensus. As I indicated, that in itself would also not change some of the capture problems that I've indicated. However, it will certainly require that at a certain level, the parties should start talking or start speaking, and that consensus should be built. The proposals made should directly tackle the problem as they assume a pragmatic posture. The recommendations on political party involvement and citizenship participation are novel, but also instructive and reflect the real politic undercurrents that need urgent tackling. For where the temptations are stronger, the checks should be more robust. Natural resource management presents that degree of temptation for rent and corruption. The regime of accountability should reflect that reality. Thank you.
Nobody invented democracy. It evolved as human nature is. People divide themselves into factions, but the end result is that there's only one nation. And no matter which party you think you belong to, the welfare of the country is essential. The issue is that what does actually a country own? When you come to think seriously about it comes back to the fact of the natural resources that you were making reference to. Because otherwise there's actually nothing that a government has. Nothing. The concept of thinking that you can go and tax the people, to me is completely nonsensical. Because how much can you tax people? How many actually earn enough to be able to pay tax and have anything left? So the natural resources which actually belongs to the state. And I have taken the position that the Constitution is clear that all minerals belong to the state and is held in trust, as you say correctly, by the president for the benefit of who? Of the people. Now, we have come to the situation whereby we negotiate with foreigners to come and exploit the minerals we have. And then they pay a royalty. And the question that I have raised is that how can you have property and then somebody comes and is paying you royalty for is yours. Why don't you rather allow the person who wants to exploit, either for oil or gold or whatever, bauxite, and sooner or later you may even have iron ore. Then he comes and he says, oh, I want to exploit. I say, fine, beautiful idea. Now how much are you going to spend in the exploitation? Let's sign an agreement and we know the amount that is involved. When you discover it, we will pay that money, or at least as the income comes, we can refund that expenditure. The rest of what you have belongs to me. But you are not working for free. So let's share it. I'll give you, let's say, 30%, then I keep 70%. That means you can work the arithmetic the way you choose. But in the end, it means that you have income that you can use for the benefit of the people, for whom it belongs, actually. Now, what we have come into is the fact that there is so much, in fact, the word corruption is being bandied here and there, so sometimes it has lost its luster, I might say. Yes. So what it actually means, nobody actually knows what it means any longer. And so someone comes and you get people go out to negotiate. And when they are negotiating, some monies are put in the bank accounts of those who are doing the negotiation. And so they come with an agreement, and Parliament is supposed to approve, right? So no one checks. You don't even have the technical ability to know how much oil is being dug out, or how much bauxite is being taken out of the country, or how much gold is being taken out of the country. Because the gold is taken as raw, it is being refined somewhere else. You have no check on the refinery over there to find out whether indeed the net of what is actually refined actually is what it belongs to. And so this is the tragedy into which we as a country have put ourselves over the years. And so I think that when I was working with Samira, I was telling her that why should a rich country like ours always go hand in hand begging? When we are so God has given us what? So much wealth that we don't know what we are doing. So this is my view, and I think the points you have raised are so valid that Parliament is not playing its proper overseas role as an overseer. We talk about democracy as being based upon checks and balances. Checks and balances. That's a concept which needs proper study for us to understand. Because the tragedy of what we have is that there are no checks and there are no balances. And so whoever wins the political party, he has power. And the cronies, some of them who contributed nothing at all even to the winning of the party, that because they are connected, they are the ones who find themselves into chairman of Minerals Commission, member of this, member of that, member of this, member of this. And it's their interest that matters, and not the interest of the people. So there is much defect in our governance process, which needs a lot of study. I want to look to my lady.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to refer us back to the book itself, to our Constitution, and to the mindset or the hope that underlines it. And it couldn't be better expressed than in the preamble, where first of all, we the people. Now sometimes you ask, what has happened to us? What has happened to we the people? Because with executive capture, parliamentary, political capture, what has happened to the people? Especially the people who don't want to become politicians, but are Ghanaian citizens, and that's most of us. And what has happened? And it's very, very important that we have seminars such as this and such illuminating presentation that does analysis of provisions which some of them I had read but had not exactly pondered about. Yes, but the preamble goes on to say, in solemn declaration and affirmation of our commitment to freedom, justice, probity, and accountability, the principle that all powers of government spring from the sovereign will of the people. And yet, our land is being given away to whom we don't know. The natural resources under our land and in our water and under our water are being given away to people we don't know whom, on what terms, with what quantities, for what duration. And you wonder, is it enslavement? What is it? It's very, very important. And our constitution is a good constitution. It's one of the best constitutions, in my view, in the world. And it has a lot of protection for we the people. But maybe it's given us so much protection, we've become very complacent. But we need to begin to wake up. And therefore, one of the recommendations that I particularly liked was the enforcement of the underlying principle that whenever something of a major shift is about to take place, particularly in property and so on and so forth in the public domain, we the people should know it's about to happen, and there should be a venue and an address and a place to which we could have our input, so that we're not always presented with fait accompli. And that is what really true democracy is about. When we go to the polls to vote for representatives, they are exactly that, representatives. And representatives, how can you be an effective representative if you're not referring back to the person that you are representing? And it shouldn't be that once every 4-year event of going to the polls. No, it should be every key thing that is being done, which is new, or which is taking us into a different space. Come and consult us again, and that's very important. So that's really all that I have to add to what Uncle Sam said. Thank you very much.
But for me, I think I want to highlight the key thing, which is how come that the national interest has been captured by the partisan interest? And what mechanisms do you need to put in place to correct that? Because until you correct that, the democracy is defined by what the partisan interest wants. And that excludes the participation of the people. Because at the end of the day, the process by which they get the vote of the people itself is, as you know, already captured. So I think we must address these issues as a matter of restructuring and redefining the democracy that we practice itself. We cannot simply assume that the nature or the model of the democracy that we have and that we are practicing is the right one for us. Because the institutions that need to be developed to practice that were not instantly created at independence. And the society evolves because the people are those institutions in order to create those institutions. But by virtue of this being imposed at a particular point in time, we adopted it and we are now growing into it. It's just like, you know, going to school early as those people whose hands did not reach their ears. And all the shorts were sewn the same size. So through class 1 to class 3, you have to hold your shorts until you grow into it. And that explains why you fall over anytime you try to run. And this is what we have been doing. You know, we have been growing into the very process of that democracy underpinned by our constitution. And we have not crossed that threshold of saying, no, we need, how long is this going to take? Is it going to take forever? And are there going to be some very major issues along the way which will prevent us from getting there altogether? Is the rate of decline higher than the rate of progress? So we cannot simply assume that by muddling through it, we will get to where we have to get to. And I think that we have the requisite intellectual ability to sit down, draw back from the process and say, look, we've practiced this for 30 years now. Let us look at where the strong points are, where the weak points are, and let us actually take a comprehensive and deep restructuring that will redefine the democracy itself, ensure that the principles of equity, participation, meritocracy are all enshrined in it, and are not just in the text of the Constitution, but in the practice of the democracy. Lastly, I want to say that definitely I agree. I agree with the general thinking that we should be as much as possible non-partisan in the process that we practice our democracy, because our interpretation of adversarial politics is very different. In fact, what is happening, I dare to say, is that some of the ethnic rivalries are beginning to translate themselves into political practice. And that is very dangerous if you're thinking about a unitary state. And this is where I say that if you don't curb the demon before he grows to a certain size, he'll get to a size where you can't control him. And I think that it is time we really think about redefining the democracy and ensuring that we restructure the Constitution to fit ourselves. There's nothing sacred about it. Thank you.
But I want to draw from the wonderful delivery the practical perspective from a development standpoint. And you made a very critical point, Mr. Speaker, Prof, about the link between the National Development Plan and the party manifestos. We come to a nation and spend tons of man-hours working with the experts to develop a national strategy or a national development plan to guide the development process. You start with a set of people who are in power, give and take 3-4 years, if there's a change of government, you come back and that document doesn't mean anything again. Very, very frustrating for us in the development arena, because then we have to go back to the drawing board and try to reconnect with a new team. So that's a very critical point you have made. The other thing is, you were talking about moving from simple majority to 2/3 or whatever. And then another big point I picked up from Honorable Samukuja was the checks and balances. Our experience in the development arena is that the checks and balances are normally well and most effectively handled by strong, independent institutions. Now, when you have partisan politics, where the president evolves from the party, and I think one of the speakers was talking about the pressure that comes to bear on the president when he takes over the reign of affairs and who must occupy which position. So he is not delinked from the legislature. And the danger we have now is that the executive, through the legislature, has permeated the national institutions that are supposed to provide the checks and balances. So you have a very serious challenge on your hands of lack of independence. So it's not even a matter of moving away from simple to majority to 2/3. There's what we call the entitlement philosophy that is behind partisan politics. It doesn't matter how well you have performed. If you have done the 8 years, for sake of argument, it is our turn. And because it is our turn, why is it our turn? We lost $50 million and didn't win. We want that money back. So it is not in our interest that you succeed. It is in our interest that you fail. So when the conditions, we have to find dubious means to undermine you, to create the enabling conditions for you to fail, for us to come in, because it's an entitlement philosophy. So I have prepared it's not enough to criticize. Based on the 30-year experience, I prepared a document which was aired on DH1 TV. I'd love to come and present it here as a way of delinking the point you just made. Cutting off the presidential executive order from the legislature so that there's independence to allow the national institutions to be more effective. That's what I will propose. I have it all done, and I'll share it with you, and if the opportunity arises, we can come and present it. Thank you very much.
Parliament more powerful, more independence, yeah? And I think in addition to the idea of raising the threshold for approval or ratification to 2/3 instead of a simple majority, why don't we seriously consider proportional representation in our electoral politics? I think Professor OQUAYE has spoken or written about this before. There are different kinds of proportional representation. And I think perhaps the time has come in our country to seriously consider it and debate it and come to a form of consensus as to which would best suit our needs. Because it is one way that could somehow chip away at the winner-takes-all, the extreme partisanship, and would allow different voices to be represented or to be heard or to be given some political power or decision-making. So I want us to start talking about and debating and seriously thinking about this. And of course, it would require some sacrifice from the government which will decide to look into that, into introducing or accepting, proportional representation. And of course, the same thing goes for the election of some of the our state agencies, or the election of DCEs, MCs, and all that. So instead of appointing them. So, but let us seriously debate proportional representation. Number 2, very quickly, is you referred to the chapter 6 or 5 of the directive of state principles. Now, when we come to talk about the private sector as the dominant, or that must have a dominant role in development and so forth, I think we need to also interrogate this. What kind of private sector are we talking about? Are we talking about the multinationals, as I was saying, multinationals who own our resources? Or what kind of private sector? I think we need to interrogate this and try and define the kind of private sector that we want to be dominant in our development. Lastly, very quickly, I think we all agree that the powers of the president must be curbed. I think if I were a president, honestly, of a country, I would want that burden of pressure from my party, pressure from the private sector. I would want it to be lifted, and I would prefer to have us arrive at certain things by more consensus building. So I think we need to be honest enough to say that the time has come, given the situation. Yes, the powers of the president must be curbed a little. Thank you.
First of all, congratulations, Professor Abochi, for the erudite presentation, and of course to IEA for organizing this. So I just want to pick up on a point that Professor Abochi made with respect to a disagreement with Professor SKB Asante. I think the point you made was that the inadequate or ineffective parliamentary oversight was due primarily to the legislature just choosing or failing to act as it should. I have a view, and I would like your thoughts on it. I think that even if that were the case, there's a structural compromise that's been built into the Constitution between the legislature and the executive. The Constitution establishes a floor rather than a ceiling. It establishes a floor below which the number of ministers coming from Parliament should not fall below. It suggests that the spirit of the Constitution, the intention of its framers, was to have a steep overlap between the legislature and the executive. So it says at least 50% of ministers must come from Parliament. That's the floor. Should it not have been, or should we not instead have a ceiling, which then signifies the reverse, that the number of ministers coming from Parliament should not be above this threshold, this upper ceiling, right? In fact, if I'm correct, the way this provision is framed could theoretically, you could have a situation where all of the ministers could come from Parliament. Theoretically. If you had the reverse, the president could choose all his or her ministers from outside Parliament if he or she chose, or in a situation where, say, an independent candidate, OQUAYE, an independent candidate is elected president who may not necessarily have, obviously, parliamentarians, sort of, from his party because he's an independent candidate. So what do you think of sort of, at least theoretically, I don't know whether in practice this can happen, considering the fact that this is an entrenched clause and any initiative to have it reversed, of course, has to start from Parliament. And I don't see really, in practice, the parliamentarians doing this to themselves. But for what it's worth as an academic exercise or a theoretical exploration of that possibility, what do you think? That, at least maybe that there's a limitation to the ceiling. Say a maximum of 20% may come from Parliament and a minimum of whatever. Thank you.
Professor Boti is one of my very good friends, so really congratulations for that brilliant presentation. One of the things I just want you to educate me again, you introduced to me, I'm not a political student, so tangible constitution. And for me, it sounds so powerful in my mind. I need to really interrogate and request that what do you mean by that? But the other issue of trusteeship, and the way you have made the presentation means that, in fact, it permeates the various sections of our Constitution. And I find it also at the very core of our current woes. Trusteeship as a mindset, trusteeship as an ethical principle that closely associates with responsible leadership. Now, given the nature of our politics, what mode of education do you need, do you think that our political elite need, that when they seek power, even through partisanship, that they will understand that leadership is trust? Because with all the institutions, because it's the human beings that are manning this. So if trusteeship is not part of our mindset, and that is why Party A will come to power and want to do the way it wants to do it. And I'm worried that politicians are telling us, in this country bestowed with so much wealth, this is our 17th time of going to the IMF. It sounds a bit shameful and worrying. But that is not even the end of the story. Last week I was here and somebody did an analysis, meaning that probably within each 4-year cycle or 8-year cycle, we might be going back to the IMF. Just because we are not doing the trusteeship. And then the last point is, as you spoke about the blueprint for our development, that in fact you said we do not even have it. Though I have been part of programs where attempts have been made to really NDPC and so on. But I was expecting that I would hear something from your presentation about the NDPC and how critical it is. Because it appears to me all the governments have not given it the empowerment that it requires to be able to do its work. So that apart from partisan projects, what is the central program that we have to guide development, whether Party A or Party B is in power? Thank you so much.
The point about the state and government. So I'll just make bullet points. The point about the state and government is the point again I made at the eminent friends meeting, as I call it. The Constitution created 2 levels of structures. We have the state and then we have government. The government is political. The state is supposed to be the legal entity. The state is supposed to be there. The political revolves. However, we have gotten to a point where the political has gradually eaten, the government has eaten into the state. So a classic illustration of the state and the government, or rather the state and the political, is the relationship between the minister and the chief director. That simple relationship, where the chief director and the ministry, the professional body is supposed to be there, serving loyally, government to government, and serving the state, and not caring about the political, but they advise the political for purposes of things running. But we have gotten to that point, unfortunately, and Honorable Chairman, I think one of the entities that facilitated that regrettably, I don't think intentionally, but regrettably, is the IEA, the Presidential Transitions Act. That law has further created a situation in which every 4 years, the whole state packs and goes away. And then there's a new state, there's a new political that comes in representing the same political and the state. But it shouldn't be. There should have been the constant state and then the political visits and leaves. That is an illustration of how we have gotten to that point of a gradual merger between the political and the state, in which the political has dominated and the state is dead. And it's everything. And it is the reason why contractors, I mentioned that, contractors will have to change because there's a new government in town. Why should it be? So that's just one example. And the entrenched clause, the opinion is well welcome. I'm not going to, there's not much time. The partisanship, again, I won't comment on that because these are all realities in our faces. How to correct the capture of national interest. So here's the thing. I will quote a statement from Madison. The reality is this, and let me just quote it. Madison said, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. And if angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In other words, the reality is that it is because humans have a capacity and propensity towards corruption. By the corruption, I don't mean corrupting, as in something getting bad. Because we have a tendency towards corruption, laws are designed to keep us on the straight and narrow to remain good. That's what law is about. It is the reason why we are making all these recommendations. The truth of the matter is we have a tendency and susceptibility towards doing the wrong thing. So all these recommendations about moving from two-thirds, or rather the ratification to approval, and then from simple majority to two-thirds, is just to make it a bit more difficult for approval processes. Because what we have seen essentially is that we've seen a government in power Unfortunately, since 1992, this has been the case. We've seen a government in power, and then we've seen the government's men in parliament. So what we don't have is that, in my opinion, and I've said this before, and it sounds radical. In fact, he's one of my best speakers. I have to say this so that I'm not in trouble. But he's one of my best speakers because he's actually the one who started the implementation of Article 108 in a manner that works. And you may have forgotten, but I was with you in Koforidua when we did a parliamentary training some time ago when you lamented on this. Since then, I'm informed reliably that we've had private members' bills passing. So I think that he actually has a good record among many speakers. But it still doesn't change the fact that Parliament, with all respect, it still doesn't change the fact that Parliament as a body has largely failed. Because what we have had, and I told my students this, that since 1992, we really have not had Parliament. What we have had is that we've had the government's parties in the entity called Parliament waiting for government to bring its business and then endorse. Bring it business. Maybe we should not even open it. Just stamp. Let's move on. Stamp. Let's move on. Since 92, that's what we've had. And the reason is because of a warped conception of the role. The role of members of parliament in parliament is that we have to promote our government. If we don't, these guys, MPP or NDC, whichever of them is in opposition, they will make them look bad. And if they look bad, we'll lose the election. So let's find a way of making sure that we push everything that goes through. That's what we've had, and that's been regrettable. The expectation is the opposite. And the opposite is parliament will be there making sure that it is scrutinizing government. But we really haven't had that. So we've had government people in parliament waiting for it. My good friend Kuku's question about the floor and the ceiling. It goes back to the idea of good intentions and bad outcomes. I think the draftsmen of the Constitution had good intentions. But as I have, again, respectfully suggested to Nana Doctor in private conversations, I think that they underestimated the capacity of the Ghanaian to exploit. No, I think so. I mean, with all respect. With the greatest respect. I think there was too much deference to the goodness of the Ghanaian. And the reason for that is this. Assuming that things were working normally well, this is how things would have panned out. We'll have a strong parliament, and then we'll have an executive who wants to create ministries anyhow. When the executive comes to parliament with a proposed minister for approval for a designated ministry, he has to justify that in the context of development, need, resources, men, among many other indices. That minister who sits in the chair trying to justify the necessity of a new ministry being created beyond those that we know and of the number that has been created, that minister will have a lot of work to do sitting in the seat of a parliament facing all these MPs. But because we do not have parliament, that is the reason why the absence of a ceiling has appeared problematic. The reason I say this is because I'm not kidding you. People think the strongest institution in Ghana may probably be the executive, followed by the courts. The strongest institution is parliament. Parliament checks everybody. I always cite the example of the late Honorable Peter Alajete, who, under the former Chief Justice, your predecessor, Justice Redu, there was Parliament requested the audits of the courts. And the courts reminded Parliament that they are independent under Article 127. And Parliament reminded them they were the people's representative. And the court reminded them they interpret what the law is. In the end, Parliament got its way. I think the court of public opinion came in. Oh, of course. They famously said, if the courts have nothing to hide, why are they trying to? So, of course, the courts allowed that. But the long and short is this. Parliament checks everybody. Everybody. They are the only entity that can check everybody. However, we all know they've reduced that business to a rubber stamping business or a public spectacle, in the case of the Public Account Committee. A spectacle. You watch, you have a few palpitations, and then that's the end of the story. Nothing really happens at the end of it. So, the floor ceiling thing, I see the frustration, but the reason for that is to allow for flexibility. You see, my understanding of the reason why the framers have left it the way it is to allow for flexibility, so that new things come up. We discovered oil, 2007 or so. This constitution was 1992. There are emerging developments that constitutional framers may not necessarily contemplate. And that's why the American Constitution is very small. So the expectation is that evolution will expand. So leaving it like that ordinarily wasn't bad, but it is because of our rather opportunistic tendencies. That is why that lack of ceiling has actually begun looking like a heaven. Almost expansive, endless sky.
So I do not really see the problem, but the problem has been aggravated by the lack of a parliamentary oversight. And we have two options at this stage. Maybe we'll go the Madisonian way, because there are no angels, we create laws. Or we remain the current way and hope that Parliament will wake up from the slumber and do its work. And the last one, I have left a few out. Forgive me, I can't go over. Or like I said, I don't want people to start walking out. I want us to. The last one has to do with the tangible. Sonia, were you the one who was asking about that? The tangible constitution? Yes, you have the tangible constitution, but then I'll tie it in also with the CPP chastisement. You know, I have known this man for a long time. He was my student in KNUST, so he's been like this, you know, very tough, right? You know, provocative. I know that he was going to provoke me. So now that he has challenged me to make sure that I remember the CPP, indeed, forgive me that I mentioned only the NDC and the MPP, and that was probably a remit on my part, given the fact that we have an Nkrumah in the room. And I shouldn't have mentioned the CPP, but it's perhaps because the Fourth Republic has been NDC and MPP. So we'll wait until there's the CPP, then we'll start talking about it. But for now, it's almost by default, you know, the MPP and CPP. But the tangible constitution, the reason I mentioned the tangible constitution is because the constitution has goods. Some people will call it public goods. So the constitution has goods. The directive principles of state policy actually has fantastic stuff. And these stuff, in some way, some will say we don't even need the development blueprint because it's there. But it's a very broad framework. But a tangible constitution is the constitution that a person can actually stand on and make claims. So let me give you one simple example for which the guy on the street will tell you there's no constitution. That guy on the street, when arrested and is sent to the police station, immediately, he probably will be there and he will not be informed of his right to counsel. He probably will be there, and even when he tries getting bail, he will not be given bail, and in some cases, he may be made to feel that he has to buy bail. The idea that you have to, you know, post some money, etc. The long and short is there's statistics to indicate, and my lady, the former Chief Justice, is here, very instrumental in the Justice for All project, so she knows this. Statistics indicate that we have more than 60-70% of all people who actually go to prison, they are not represented. And if you are represented by counsel, the chances of you going to jail, that is if the matter is 50-50, is 50-50. If you are not represented, even a good case can become bad because, you know, the tendency is that we have a system that appears to, you know, be against people, maybe not deliberately, but it just evolved that way. Be against people who have no representation in the legal system. This is just one example of the tangible constitution. For that person, the rule of law is a mirage. For that person, you give him all the lectures about equality of representation, everybody, it's a joke. So the constitution is intangible when people cannot manifest and access it. The constitution is a tangible piece of document when the public goods that are inherent therein can actually be concretized, manifested, and accessed by the people. And I think that is a distinction between the tangible and intangible. In another piece written by a great American constitutional lawyer, Lawrence Tribe, the title he gave it is The Unwritten Constitution. And for him, the unwritten constitution is the thing you actually don't see. Because the constitution we have, it contains one thing which you see, but it contains another thing you don't see. And that other aspect you don't see is the real constitution. The reason why you're saying that was because the American constitution, like I said, is about 1/3 of ours. But American constitutional jurisprudence is about 20 times ours. Now, what makes a constitution is not the letter and document you see. It is the jurisprudence that comes out of the real development. Otherwise, it is a piece of paper that has no meaning. In fact, this is the best we have had in our history. And the reason is because it is the one that has generated the most jurisprudence. But we certainly can do better. And it is the difference between what you see written here and the actual thing that happens on the ground. And that is why I advise my students, be very fearful of an angry policeman. Because if you start quoting the law immediately, you may get a few slaps before you are stabilized, before we start even talking about what you think you know. No, those are realities. Because that guy there gets angry and frustrated when he thinks that you are standing in his way. Find a balancing way of even asserting your rights. And it is what makes the difference between, you know, asserting your rights in a Ghanaian constitutional context in another country's constitutional system. So I'm sorry if I haven't been able to touch your questions, but we have been advised that we are way behind time. But thank you very much.
Audio or one that is written, so that at the end of this, we can have very, very well articulated views by these wonderful people who always come to contribute. Next week, we are visiting President Kufuor The week after, we'll be here again, and we'll be hearing from Justice Broby, former Supreme Court judge. I thank you all very much.